Hello again. I'd like to make a comment about some of the things that you talked about in the week 2 of Understanding Wireless. Many of you had some confusion over public goods versus private goods, and that confusion is well warranted. Remember, what we did is we made the distinction between two characteristics of all kinds of goods. And by the way, these are both goods and services we're talking about. We talked about the characteristic of excludability or non-excludability and the characteristic of rivalry or non-rivalry. Now, where did those characteristics come from? We didn't mention that in the course materials, but perhaps it's warranted so that you'll understand exactly why you're having some confusion in the comments. Economists, for a very long period of time, didn't make a very clear distinction between public goods and private goods, or between collective goods and what we call a commons. What happened is Paul Samuelson, the Nobel Economics laureate from MIT, in 1954 made the distinction in an article where he very clearly outlined what was and what was not a public good in exactly the way that we presented it in the course materials. Now, realize that economists had talked about public goods and private goods for a very long time, but we just hadn't defined them very clearly. And actually, when I say defined them very clearly, even that is a bit ambiguous, as you pointed out to me. It's the case that there is no such thing really as a public good or a private good, a purely public good or a purely private good. What actually happens is you could think of a continuum, with public goods being on one side, private goods being on the other. And in fact, all goods fall somewhere in between. Some fall closer to being a public good, some fall closer to being a private good or service. And the same thing holds true with collective goods and commons. In other words, there's a lot of wishy-washy gray area in between. And that's exactly what you were telling me in the comments. And you are absolutely correct. There is no perfect distinction between a public good and a private good. So when we, for instance, called a lighthouse a public good, what we were doing is we were saying, at least in the term of an 18th century physical lighthouse with an actual light and a Fresnel lens, that was more like a public good than it was a private good. And when we talked about a can of Coke, which you had purchased from a machine, that was more like a private good than a public good. The important distinction is important to us because the wireless arena takes place in an area where we're trying to figure out, is the spectrum through which all wireless communication takes place a public good or is it a private good? Because as we pointed out in the course materials, it makes a difference in the way you treat it. It makes a difference in the way you treat it economically. It makes a difference in the way you treat it in a regulatory sense. And therefore, it becomes one of the most important characteristics of the course is to understand the difference between a public and a private good, and a collective good and a commons as well.